Hi everyone, hi AREAA, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the seminar on 1031s and the impact of COVID-19. We've got an amazing guest today, Mr. Evan Liddiard. He's a CPA. He's also the Director of Federal Tax Policy at NAR, which is the National Association of Realtors. Evan has an impressive background. He's the former chairman for the Senate Finance Committee. He also joined the National Association of Realtors 7 years ago after serving for more than 20 years as a senior tax policy advisor for Senator Orrin Hatch. He was Senator Hatch's lead advisor on tax policy issues, as well as issues regulating the budget, financial services, and Social Security. He previously served as Senator Hatch's legislative director, coordinating and directing the senator's all his legislative efforts in a variety of areas. In the middle of his Senate career, he took a 3-year hiatus from Capitol Hill to be a partner at the legislative tax practice of KPMG's National Tax Office in Washington. And before going to Capitol Hill, he was also the tax manager in the Salt Lake City and Washington National Tax Offices of Deloitte. So he's got a very, very impressive background. I am Ritu Rani. I'm the Commercial Vice Chair for AREAA. I've got my MBA and a corporate background, but today I am a commercial real estate agent, and I also work as a consultant with Fortitude Investment Group. And the reason why I mention Fortitude is that they are private wealth management firms that work with investors who own commercial real estate, and they really specialize in products providing 1031s for their clients. So, their financial advisors are very well versed in this. So if you need me as a resource after this, I'd be happy to help any of you. So I want to get to the meat of this presentation. When Evan and I had our background call, we thought it would be best for Evan to start by giving everyone a quick background on 1031s, sharing the basics with you, and giving you all the, the 45, the 180 days, like all of the basic things with 1031s, and then sharing what NAR is really doing to help investors navigate around the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's some changes to the rules and extensions, which he's going to share with us. So, Evan, I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you, Ritu. It's great to be with you all, and good afternoon. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about the basics of 1031 and then also get into what's happening in connection with the current pandemic with the deadlines. And I'm going to have to go through this fairly quickly, but you'll find that there's quite a bit of material on the slides. And if anybody has any questions afterward, we'll have some time to answer those, I think. Next slide, please. I first want to cover some of these basics, and much of this is what I cover with my tax class that I teach for graduate tax students at American University, only we're not going to get into much more than just the basics. Many of you will be familiar with this, I'm sure already, so it might be a review for you. This all, of course, comes from Section 1031 of the Internal Revenue Code. However, many of the rules are given to us by some very generous regulations that have evolved over the course of a number of decades that have set up this regime that's very favorable. However, many of you probably realize that we nearly lost 1031 for real estate in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. In fact, we did lose 1031 for personal property and for collectibles, but due to the hard work of many realtors and many other real estate professionals who formed a coalition and fought like tigers to keep 1031 for real estate, we were successful by meeting with a lot of members of Congress and their staff to reiterate and emphasize just how important they are for economic growth and to the economy of local areas and states and the nation. And so we kept it, but it's no longer available for anything except real property. As you can see from this slide, Section 1031A1, the basic section provides that no gain or loss is recognized on the exchange of real property that's held for the productive use in a trade or business or for investment if it's exchanged solely for another parcel of such real property. Now that's the general rule, but we have to emphasize a few little things that are very important. The first thing is the fact that we have to have an exchange instead of somebody selling it and then buying another property and taking the gain and rolling it over into another one. That's a separate idea. It has to be a swap. And the same taxpayer has to be there that exchanges the old one to get the new one. It can't be a related entity such as the investor's corporation or a corporation subsidiary. It has to be the actual tax-paying entity that relinquished the other property in order for it to be a valid exchange. Now, the good news is that in the qualifying use requirement, there's no substantial difference between property held for investment and property used by a business. Thus, an investor or a business owner are treated exactly the same for this. Next slide, please. There are some limitations, as you can see here on this slide. First, and very important, in the wake of the 2017 Act changes, both personal use property and personal property are excluded, of course. Personal use property will be things like a vacation home. Even if you rent it out part-time, if it's primarily a vacation home, it's not going to be eligible for a like-kind exchange. Now, the regulations do allow an incidental amount of personal property to be counted as real property and exchanged if two conditions are met. First, the property has to be typically transferred with the larger item. And second, the fair market value of all the incidental property cannot exceed 15% of the fair market value of the overall real property. So for example, if you're swapping an apartment building and it happens to have laundry equipment in it, such as washers and dryers, of course, that's personal property, but it's probably very standard in the industry to include such personal property when you sell. And if it doesn't come to more than 15% of the value, or in other words, for $1 million apartment building, if that laundry and all the other personal property didn't exceed $150,000, it will be included as part of the exchange. Also, fortunately, we have favorable treatment for all types of real estate being considered like kind to all other real estate. That's always been the case, and it still applies. So, for example, if you're a farmer and you own a farm or a ranch and you want to trade it in when you retire for an apartment building, that's just fine. That's like kind. So is a movie theater and an office building. The only thing that becomes a problem, really, with real estate is where it's located. If you got property overseas or in a foreign jurisdiction and you want to swap it for domestic property, that's not going to work. And unfortunately, even Puerto Rico, for this purpose, is considered to be foreign property. Otherwise, if it's part of the United States or the other possessions, you can switch back and forth and not have to worry about it, but not for foreign property. Next slide, please. Let's take a quick look at the different types of basic exchanges. The most fundamental one is also a very rare one, and that is the straight two-party exchange. Now, I'm not saying these don't ever happen, because they probably do, but it's quite rare that you might find somebody that you know that has exactly the same property value with something you want and they want yours. And so you just plan on doing an exchange straight across the board, or you might even have a little bit of money exchanged. It could happen. It's just not a very common thing. But this is the original type of exchange that goes back to legislative history in the 1920s. And it's certainly permissible, but luckily the concept has been built on from this, and it's gotten more sophisticated and allows for a lot more useful exchanges. If we can go to the next slide, we can talk about three-party exchanges. As the idea of the exchanges evolved over the decades, a practical way was found to get around the difficulties of the two-party exchange by finding somebody who'd be willing to purchase the property for you or assist you by purchasing the property that you want and then doing a two-party exchange with him or her. Now, in theory, this works fine because the purchaser and the seller are both treated as having regular sales. But the purchaser doesn't have to worry about paying any tax because he or she purchased the property for exactly the same amount they're going to be selling it to the taxpayer. So there's no gain. Next slide, please. But one problem with this technique was that the purchaser looks an awful lot like an agent or acting as an agent for the taxpayer. And often the IRS would assert that this isn't a real exchange because the investor is simply making an exchange with himself or herself. Another problem was that the purchaser, who's kind of doing you a favor here, maybe taking a small fee, might not like the idea of taking title to a property that he or she is not going to own for more than just a short time, a few minutes maybe, as this could potentially open them up to legal problems in cases of unknown environmental or other problems like brownfields or leaking underground storage tanks, that kind of thing. So why would somebody want to take that on when they have that potential liability that could come back and bite them later on? Next slide, please. So it's evolved, luckily, into what is the most common type of exchange, and that is when you have four parties. And actually, it's just three parties, but the QI, or qualified intermediary, is acting as the intermediary and stepping in and creating kind of a four-party thing. These are also known as exchange accommodators. Now, the use of QIs go all the way back to 1935, but in the like kind of exchange world was a bit of a battleground for many years between taxpayers and the IRS until a case called Starker came out in the mid-1970s that eventually opened the door for the current law treatment that's been established by regulations that were issued in early 1990. These regulations set out strict requirements for how exchanges can be accomplished to receive the desired tax treatment. They set up a safe harbor for QIs, where the intermediary is essentially treated as acquiring and transferring both the relinquished and the replacement property. The money, and this is very key, the money can't ever touch the hands of the taxpayer, but it goes to the QI when the old property is sold, and then that money is transferred to the seller when the replacement property is acquired. And these are the basics. I'm sure that any of you who have done a QI, done an exchange have done it this way. Now on this slide, next slide please, we see more details for how all this works under the regulatory scheme for 1031. The safe harbor that's been set up overcomes that potential agency problem. Now naturally, these qualified intermediaries don't perform this service for free, but they're compensated with a fee paid by the taxpayer making the exchange. And that's how they run their business. They do this full time, all the time, and there are quite a few of them around. Now, with any major kind of business transactions, finding the right qualified intermediary can be a critical thing. Reputation and the relationships they have are very important. And as with any industry, there have been some bad apples and some losses due to fraud from unscrupulous actors in the QI community. But the vast majority of them are honest and reliable. The best thing to do is just talk to somebody who's used somebody and get a reference from people you trust and go with them. Or many times people have two or three they use all the time, I think. Go to the next slide, please. Now, there are two kinds of exchanges one can make with the help of a QI. The first is the simultaneous exchange, which is when the investor or the business owner has already identified a seller for the old property and knows what the new property they want to have to replace the relinquished one. In this case, the QI will sell the old one on behalf of the taxpayer and purchase the new property at the same time. And thus they hold the cash for only a very short time, maybe just a few minutes. Now, I don't know for sure, but I suspect these are relatively less common than the other kind of exchange that use facilitators, which we'll talk about now, and that's the deferred exchange. Now, this deferred exchange is just as it sounds. The previously owned property is first sold at the time referred to on the slide as date number 1. In this case, the taxpayer knows that he or she wants to make a like-kind exchange, but hasn't yet had the opportunity to locate a suitable replacement property. But there's a willing buyer, so they don't want to wait to make this person have to look around for something else while they locate what they want to buy. And so they go ahead and sell it and use the QI to collect the money, hold the title, and so forth. And the QI holds that money from the sale of the old property until such time as the new property that the investor wants to get has been identified. Next slide, please. And here's where we come to the date requirements that we'll talk about at length here in a few minutes. Under the rules of the deferred exchange, the taxpayer has just 45 days from the date of the sale of the first property to identify a possible new investment property. Now note that that's a possible one. It's not the final one necessarily, but you have to identify a possible property or properties to invest in. Now, how exactly is this done? Well, the taxpayer must send a notice to the qualified intermediary of the identification of at least one replacement property within that 45-day deadline. He or she can identify more than one replacement property. In fact, they can identify up to 3 or even more if the total fair market value of the total number of replacement properties is not more than twice as much as the amount of the property or properties that were relinquished to start the transaction. So those rules are important to keep in mind. It gives you flexibility in trying to identify something, but you don't have to settle on it until later on. So that 45-day rule comes very quickly. The other deadline provides that the taxpayer must close on and receive the final replacement property or properties by the earlier of 180 days after transferring the relinquished property or the due date with extensions of the tax return for the year in which the old property was transferred. Okay, next slide, please. So what's the policy reasons behind these 45-day and 180-day time limits? I'm not exactly sure as to the rationale behind the 45-day rule. In fact, some members of the NAR Federal Tax Committee have expressed their desire for us to get behind legislation that would eliminate the 45-day rule. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't, except for the fact that we've been fighting to keep 1031 alive to begin with, and we didn't want to focus on something that's relatively minor but still important when we're fighting to keep real estate in 1031. The 180-day rule makes a little bit more policy sense, I think, in that it seeks to require an end to the limbo of somebody having sold their previous property and planning to exchange it and having this out there for a while. In other words, it gives them half a year to decide whether they do want to have an exchange or whether they just want to sell it and pay the tax. So it kind of closes the door after 6 months, and unless the IRS not allow people to keep this thing alive for more than one tax return. So I can understand that. I don't hear a lot of complaints about having the 180-day rule, except, and if you go to the next slide, except at a time like we have right now, when both the 45-day rule and the 180-day rule are a major problem if you can't get into a property to check it out and see if you want to buy it, or if you want to perhaps choose it as a possible replacement property. So what we have right now is people who are in the middle of these exchanges and are bumping up against one of these deadlines, but are often prevented from doing what needs to be done because of no fault of their own. They can't get in to see a building, or they can't get in to close on the one they want to buy. Or other like kind of exchanges might be further along, as I say, and be up against the 180-day rule, and they can't close. So in either case, they're in jeopardy of not getting the deferred tax treatment they're hoping for and they were intending to get when they entered into the 1031 exchange. And it's not due to any fault of their own, but because of this national pandemic emergency. So at NAR, we began to hear concerns about 1031 and these two deadlines not long after the crisis hit and people started working from home. In fact, by March 17th, we had drafted a letter to the Treasury Department and IRS asking for relief from this problem. And I was hearing from half a dozen people a day from around the country saying, hey, what's going on? Can we get some relief here? The following week, enough of our colleagues in other commercial real estate trade associations were also concerned enough that we signed a joint letter that was much like the first letter to the IRS and Treasury asking for this relief. Now, it took a while, it took about 3 weeks to get it, but on April 9th, the IRS released Notice 20-23, which grants deadline relief, and that's what I want to go to now on the next slide and walk you all through how that works. This relief that was granted was very helpful, but it's not perfect. It expands on the earlier relief, and all of you know that the IRS, one of the first things they did was to postpone the tax return filing date and the payment date from April 15th, where it's been for many years, to July 15th for this year. But it didn't include all the types of tax returns. And so they, with this Notice 2020-23, they included as many as they could think that would fall into it, including a few of these time-sensitive actions that we fall under. Now, if you were to pull out IRS Notice 20-23, you would be looking in vain to try to find the words 1031 or like-kind exchange because they're not there. Instead, they're listed by reference of Revenue Procedure 2018-58, which was put out 2 years ago as a result of a national disaster that had been declared by the president. It gave relief in the area of the disaster for both the 45-day and the 180-day deadlines for 1031 like-kind exchanges. In this case, it gave them 120 days extra to do those time-sensitive actions. Some of you might be also interested in noting that there's a 180-day deadline relief package here for opportunity zones, for those who might be interested in that too. But the last item you'll see on this slide is that there's still some confusion about exactly how this notice works, and that continues. Some of the tax experts that took a look at that provision, at this notice, said, we're still not sure that this reference to Revenue Procedure 2018-58, if it gives us a delay of 120 days, or if it's like I think personally, that it only gives relief if your 45-day or your 180-day deadline falls within the period of April 1st to July 14th, in which case it extends that deadline, whichever it might be, to July 15th. So it can be great relief if you happen to have a 45-day or 180-day deadline in early March, it kicks it all the way to July 15th. If it happened to fall in early July, you get just a few days. Others who have read this think that the 120-day delay that was given in Revenue Procedure 2018-58 was also included. There's enough question about this that the group that sent the earlier letter sent another letter this past Monday asking the IRS to clarify this issue. And in case it's like I think that we only have the temporary relief up to July 15th, asking for the 120-day relief as well. Plus, we also have an ask that people who might have had deadline problems that fell before April 1st also get relief. And so we're asking that this relief be extended back to March 13th, because as everybody knows, most of the country was totally shut down the last 10 days or even 15 days of March. And if you happen to have had a 1031 in the middle at that time, you might have ended up not being able to fulfill one of those deadlines, and it's not covered by Notice 2020-23. And so we're asking for that to be done. Of course, that letter was just sent. We don't know what IRS will do, but we're hoping that we'll get further relief and it will go out even farther. And of course, if this country is still shut down in July, we're going to need something more anyway, because people just cannot do 1031 if they can't close on the property or identify other properties. And with that, we'll turn to any questions and answers that we have.
Thank you so much, Evan. That was really helpful. I actually, your last point about the disaster relief, that 120 days, you're referring to the disaster extension provision in the U.S. tax code, and right. That's what you're trying to help with?
Exactly. That's what we're hoping, but it's just not clear that it's in there right now.
So as of right now, April 1st is the fine. It's the cutoff.
It's anybody who has a deadline between April 1st and July 14th. They can move that deadline to July 15th. And so it's pretty good, especially for those who have that deadline period. But it would be better if we had 120 days.
Of course, of course. So we do have some questions. The first is just about vacation properties. If someone owns a vacation property and it's rented for a minimum of 14 days, but the owner actually uses it as well for less than 14 days, does that qualify as a property that you could use as a 1031?
Yes, if it still qualifies as a rental property and it doesn't exceed those minimum personal days, and it'll still be considered investment property that can be exchanged with a 1031.
Okay.
But if they spend more time than what's allowed, then no, it's personal at that point. Okay.
We have another question about construction, and I'm assuming this is, pre-construction, all of that. Atsuko, if you have any clarifications on that, do those kind of properties qualify for 1031?
If it's not fully constructed and placed into service yet? I don't think so.
For my knowledge, it is not.
Raw
Atsuko,
land,
yeah, she's talking about new construction.
it, raw land or any kind of real estate interest, essentially, if it's an investment or if it's in a business, should qualify for 1031. So I think it does qualify, even if it's not finished in construction, because the land certainly does.
Oh, she's asking about new construction. New construction projects would qualify.
If it's an investment or if it's used in business, yes.
There's another question about the FDIC, and I asked Tony to clarify a little bit. He's asking about the FDIC protection for exchange funds, since the FDIC only has a $250,000 limit on exchange funds. Does the investor have any protection on this?
That's something I don't know. I haven't heard that before, so I'm not aware.
Okay. Okay. I actually, I don't see any other questions, but I have a question for you. We talked about, or you were speaking about how difficult it is now for investors to identify properties because you can't get in to see things because of all the rules in place. Have you seen a surge in investors looking for other types of opportunities, such as the DST, in lieu of a traditional like-for-like change?
I haven't seen that. And this is going to vary based on what it is. If you're looking for raw land, you probably aren't going to be that limited in terms of identifying a property. If you're just looking for a farm, you can buy it. But if you're looking at an apartment building and you want to get in and check out the details or even look at some of the apartments, people aren't going to be very happy about somebody traipsing through at this particular time. And so it's naturally going to be difficult to get in and see everything you need to see when there are people around. So it's going to vary, but I'll say in many cases it will be impossible if there are people that are limiting the ability of a would-be purchaser to check it out.
Okay. You talked a lot about the QIs, the qualified intermediaries, in your presentation. Can you share a little bit with people who are possibly working with clients, like how do they identify a QI? Where do they go to find a QI? Because they can't hold the money themselves and just say, right, oh, it's with my attorney. We're going to buy something. So.
Right. Well, as I say, the best thing I think is to find somebody else that's been doing real estate for some time. And when you look at the real estate professionals, many of them help a client do it, or many of them hold investment property themselves. I think we had a survey of several years ago that indicated something like 35 or 40% of NAR members have done it in exchange on their own behalf or behalf of a client. So talk to somebody who's done one. Talk to somebody who knows a qualified intermediary and get a reference, and maybe talk to 2 or 3 people, and just don't choose the first one that you see, or maybe not based on just their website. There are plenty of them. If you Google QI, you're going to find dozens of them, and many of them are going to be fine. But I always like the idea of having somebody refer to you from somebody you trust.
Absolutely, it's very important. Someone asked, do you know about transference of a DST? Do you want to talk a little bit about DSTs, or?
I'm not an expert with those. I think that would be a Delaware trust.
Yes. Well, I know a little bit about it. If you'd like me to take that question, they just said, do you know about the transference? So, a DST works very similar to a regular 1031. It's a fractional ownership in something. So the rules are pretty much the same as for a 1031. It acts exactly like a 1031. So that was for Jacqueline.
It's very handy for people like that farmer I mentioned. That somebody wants to retire from being a farmer and they trade their 2,000 acres in on a portion of a big apartment building in the city that's going to be somewhat nearby where they live, where they don't have to do much activity. Right. They're back in the town where they have more facilities to take care of them in their older age, perhaps.
Right. Jacqueline's asking, not like kind. It doesn't matter. As long as you're doing an investment, it doesn't matter, Jacqueline. Any DST, you can transfer if you have a multi-family one. Anything is fine.
That's the beauty of real estate in 1031.
Yes.
Interesting, back when we had personal property, the rules for personal property were much more strict. For example, even a farmer that wanted to exchange a bull or a breeding horse couldn't change a horse for a cow, or even a certain kind of a bull for another kind of bull. It had to be like kind, strictly the same thing. Or a truck for a car was not permissible, but real estate is very, very lax on those rules, and it's very beneficial to the investor.
Right. Okay. Well, we're right at the 5:30 mark, so I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. Thank you so much, Evan, for joining us. If anyone has any other questions about 1031s or DSTs or anything, feel free to reach out to me. You know, I can connect you with Evan also. I want to field, I don't know, Evan, how open you are to helping the AREAA community, but you know, we'd love to have you as a resource also, but
I think family, I think.
Yeah, I can definitely help. You can shoot me an email, send me a text. It's ritu305@gmail. And with that, I think everyone have a great evening, and thank you so much, Evan. We really appreciate you and your time today.
Great to be with you. Everybody take care, stay safe.